Okay, welcome to the podcast. We don't have a lot of time to lose. This is the Godward Show, and I'm your host, Casey. This is another banger of an episode, but honestly, you need to listen to all 93 episodes in the backlog or whatever before you get to this one. There's a lot going on here. This is a provocative episode in the sense that I am trying to sort of invite people to dialogue or dialectic, participate with me. Certainly disagree with me, but if you do disagree with me, understand what I'm trying to do, which is to try to understand this question better. And so try to make the comments productive, right? Try to point me in the direction of a source I can check out if you think I'm wrong or whatever. I do assume most of my listeners are going to think I'm wrong about this. But I want to say before I start, I've been thinking about this for 20 solid years. I don't think it's an easy question. If you hear this and think it's an easy question, I would push back and say, look, I don't think you've quite understood the question yet. It seems to be an almost eternal sort of question. And so explore it with me. I've stayed quiet long enough. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate that anti-Protestantism, the kind you see online where it's like Protestants are to blame for everything these days, that this is generally a function of immature or naive utopian thinking, the kind we usually associate with Marxists or whatever. Now, before I continue, let me add some qualifiers here. I'm unlimited Protestantism or Protestantism that slides into materialist anarchism and libertarianism is not what I have in mind here. I'm speaking chiefly, and you might say, well, it all does. Well, maybe, but I don't know. I mean, we'll get to that sort of at the end, maybe. But even more abstractly, or sort of one layer deeper, I'm actually speaking about a philosophical problem, about the problem of authority. Okay, that's what we're going to call this for the next couple episodes, by the way. Probably the next 5 episodes. I'm really interested in it again. I've been thinking about this for a long time. I've got a couple episodes lined up that are going to culminate, by the way, with Paul's letter to the Galatians for episode 100. So the question of authority, or the problem of authority, which involves here's how I phrased it here. Michael Millerman asks, what is your idea of a good philosophical question? And I say, how do we justly balance the need for hierarchies, authority, and institutions with the need, this seems obvious and self-evident to me, on the other hand, to check these institutions or to allow for dissent when the institutions go sideways. And so then there's the analog question, basically how do we punish dissent if it isn't justified? Okay, so I'm going to use Christian religious Protestantism as one of my chief examples here. This question is applicable, though, as it relates to any institution that claims to have authority. So you can think of education institutions or medical institutions or legal institutions, even up to and including the state itself. And we might even discuss less obviously constructed institutions, things like the family or even the conscience. Now, I'm going to consider at least 3 texts in this episode. First, Jacques Derrida's essay, The Mystical Foundation of Authority. Then a text from the Christian Gospels showing the Pharisaic attempt to cling to authority and Jesus' move to challenge them. And then I was going to cover Martin Luther's 95 Theses or quote Milton's Areopagitica, but I don't think I have time for that in this episode, but there will be other references, no doubt. Needless to say, this episode is, as I'm warning you, more theoretical than my usual episodes and should not be viewed by beginners, frankly, whose time would be much better spent starting on episode 2 and catching up. You're at the advanced course now. Okay, so first, the Derrida essay. Derrida begins by mulling over the phrase, the force of law, and its corollary, to enforce the law. In French, the phrase is appliquer la loi, which sounds closer to the application of the law. But his point is that there is a kind of energetic movement described in the phrase, and that if we're to consider justice as law, which is really an important thing to consider here, especially lately, I think, as everyone, especially anti-liberals and reactionaries, seem to believe that laws are what make men just. Here, Derrida says something that I think I understand pretty deep in my bones now, but that if you're not thinking like I am, you might stumble over. He says, and I'm going to put this on your screen so you can read along because it's dense. Quote, applicability or enforceability is not an exterior or secondary probability that may or may not be added as a supplement to law. It is the force essentially implied in the very concept of justice as law, which he keeps saying droit, I guess that's the French word for it, which also means right, by the way, of justice as it becomes droit, of the law as droit. For I want to insist right away on reserving the possibility of a justice, indeed of a law, that not only exceeds or contradicts law, droit, but also, perhaps, has no relation to law or maintains such strange relation to it that it may just as well command the droit that excludes it. No doubt, you should listen to this a couple of times, and I hope I've remembered to put it visually on your screen so that you can pause and consider it. What could Derrida mean here by saying that he wants to reserve the possibility of a justice, quote, indeed of a law that contradicts law, or that has no relation to law? This is quite mysterious. He clarifies by pointing again to the meaning of the word itself, enforceability, or applicability, and then arrives at the conclusion that all law maintains itself by force, which is to say, by violence or the threat of violence. The German word he uses here comes from a Walter Benjamin article titled or called Critique of Violence, and the word there is Gewalt. Derrida then adds, quote, Gewalt, and you're going to hate me for these German pronunciations, I'm just sounding it out my best I can. Quote, Gewalt also signifies for Germans legitimate power, authority, public force. Gesetzgebende Gewalt is legislative power. Geistliche Gewalt is the spiritual power of the church. And Staatsgewalt, the authority or power of the state. Gewalt, then, is both violence and legitimate power, justified authority. How are we to distinguish between the force of law, of a legitimate power, and the supposedly originary violence that must have established this authority, and that could not itself have been authorized by any other, or by any anterior legitimacy, so that, in this initial moment, it is neither legal nor illegal, or others would quickly say, neither just nor unjust. His point here is that any legal system claims the right to punish, but that on a meta level, these legal systems, by their nature, always show a preference for one way over another, one set of values over another. And they assume that preference as a kind of a priori starting point. These systems of justice simply proclaim themselves so. And by the proclamation and the violence that enforces it, the laws legalize themselves. Now, in general, this violence, at least like in the 18th century, as we learn, or sort of after the 18th century, as we learned from my recent Foucault videos, this violence obscures itself, right? It takes these obscure forms. Derrida says, quote, there is no law without enforceability, and no applicability or enforceability of the law without force. Whether this force be direct or indirect, physical or symbolic, exterior or interior, brutal or subtly discursive and hermeneutic, coercive or regulative, and so forth. That's a very important point. He said, all law operates by force, but even something like subtle discourse can be understood here as violence. So things like gaslighting, gatekeeping, shadow banning, like that kind of peer review that keeps the stuff they don't want out of the academy and so forth. This is all a kind of violence understood in these Derridian terms. Now, okay, begin with me again. If you recall, somewhere between 2008 and 2018 or so, you became aware that America was becoming clownish and absurd. Supreme Court justices were finding hidden rights to same-sex marriage in the Constitution. Pronouns became problematic. AstroTurfed race riots were deployed to steer the outcomes of elections, just to name a few examples. And somewhere in all of that disorienting upheaval, you heard someone on Twitter saying something about how, against all of that chaos and anarchy, we need a strongman politician of our own kind who will rectify the names and basically make the law firm and traditional again. So you saw the flagrantly over-sexualized women on TikTok and you thought, yes, law can fix that. Now, if you understand Derrida's point about the law being kind of violent or violence, this question becomes rather high stakes very quickly. Certainly we don't like the crazy clown world laws threatening to do violence to us normal people now, but are we prepared to impose violence on them by imposing or enforcing or applying laws that establish and maintain our own authority over them by threat of violence? Now, some of you are comfortable with that. You may go, yes, we are ready to do that. Okay? And I understand. If you have unshakable faith in the sorts of institutions that our strong man, was it Donald Trump or is it someone else, like someone coming? Okay, then maybe you don't hesitate to endorse ruling the wrong-headed by enforcing right behavior guidelines on them. That is, even if you can't change their conscience, you can change their behaviors. And if you're so convinced of your righteousness, you might reasonably do that kind of thing with the law, with the force of the law. Now, before I throw the wrench in, try again to consider all of this philosophically. That is, with a certain amount of detachment, and by remembering to transfer to other scenarios. So I mean, for instance, remember, the left may equally be convinced of their own righteousness, and they may feel comfortable inflicting their quote-unquote right-mindedness on you. And in fact, we're probably closer to that being a reality than we are to the one where, the strong-based man sweeps in and sets stuff straight by his authoritarian legal reforms. So be a little cautious about that. But okay, here's the wrench situation. I want to look at chapter 21 of the Gospel of Matthew. I'm going to use the ESV version because it's just clear. And it adds a helpful section headline there that says, "The authority of Jesus challenged." But actually, it's kind of the other way around, isn't it? It's Jesus challenging the already established authority of the ruling establishment. So read it with me on your screens. "And when he, Jesus, entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching and said, 'By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?' Jesus answered them, 'I also will ask you one question, and if you tell me the answer, then I also will tell you by what authority I do these things.' And here's the question. The baptism of John, where did it come from? From heaven or from man?" And they, the chief priests and elders, discussed it among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, 'Then why did you not believe him?' But if we say from man, we're afraid of the crowd, for they all hold that John was a prophet." So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And he said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Now, remember, many of you, my listeners, the based, trad, right-wing guy, you want to make the old laws enforceable again. You don't like these new startup reform moralities, and you think the law to use New Testament terminology, gives life. Okay? But I, the Pauline Protestant liberal Christian, want you to consider or reconsider this passage more carefully. The situation is that the chief priests and elders of the people are the established authorities, the ones who are in power. They are the lawgivers of the land and the traditionalists, the moral traditionalists. They ask Jesus by what authority he is doing what he's doing. At this point, you might expect him to pull the God card, right? You should expect him. If you're carefully understanding how narrative works, the question this section begs is, okay, how's he going to answer the charge, right? Like, by what authority are you doing this? By what authority? Well, God gave it to me, right? So you would expect him to say, well, I do these things by the authority given specifically to me and like only to me by God. Please try to think through this all carefully with me. We would expect Jesus to say, listen, I understand that until now in our religion, you, the sons of Levi, were the authorities. But now there's a new priesthood in town, which I, God's Son, your Messiah, proclaim to you. And then he should have done a miracle, basically, to prove that he was what he was saying he was. Okay? Now, by the way, the same sort of thing happens in John chapter 10, 30 through 38, and you should read it. And if you do read it, ask yourself this same question. Why, when Jesus is asked about the blasphemy that he seems to be saying, why doesn't he say to them, hey, I know this would be blasphemy if I were just some guy. Okay, but the reason it's not is that I'm co-equal with God. In other words, he should have appealed to an exception, right? He should have said, I'm God is why. But instead, he appeals to Psalm 82:6, okay, which is a general reference to the sons of God, all of us, basically, or at least all of us who are Jews. And so in this case, if you look at it closely and try to be fair, he replies to their question about his authority with a question about the authority of John. Okay, so what authority did John have? Now, again, authority means the power to enforce the law, right? So John was the son of a temple priest, but he's way out of his lane when we first meet him, right? Out there in the desert, dunking people in a muddy river. He's, you guys know, right? You've heard me say he's wearing camel skins, he's eating bugs and honey, and that's it. And it's like, this is a wild man, okay? And yet, though he was not officially sanctioned by the ruling hierarchy and institution, people would come to him to hear him. They even wanted to be baptized by him. And so the question is, what gave him the right to do that? God or a social construction, an institution? Well, from an institutional point of view, he did not have a right. So it's not that, okay? And the chief priest should have simply said, he doesn't have a right to baptize. Okay? That was the correct answer to Jesus' question. And from here's the thing, from a trad reactionary institutionalist or Jewish perspective, that should be the answer. However, the word of God continues. The chief priests have to discuss it. And so they hesitate. Why do they hesitate? Because if they say God gave John the right, then of course they should defer to John. They should go get baptized by John. But if they say a social construction, well, then what's the problem there, right? Basically, populism would be the problem. The people all believe John is a prophet. The point is, the people all clearly believe John even more than they believe the institution of the rabbis in the temple. So the point is, institutions are only sanctioned, are only justified by populism. If they don't serve the populism, what are they? They're just construction. They're bad constructions. They sort of de facto are not authoritative anymore. And so, people are believing John even more than they're believing the institutions of the rabbis in the temple. And of course, Jesus implies his authority works the same way. Now, the question this poses in relation to our theme of authority and the law is this. Listen. certainly every church institution, or really every institution, claims a certain kind of authority. But if any individual contradicts the institution, we arrive again at this question of authority. Now, of course, this controversy arises whether the challenger to the institution is a true prophet or a false prophet claiming to be a true one. And this is part of the difficulty. Basically, how do we recognize them? How do we sort them, right? So take somebody like Martin Luther, for example. In terms of a narrative, he made a very similar kind of challenge. But, hold on, there are two major variables to consider anytime one of these challenges to an institution is made. So in this case, like one, was Martin Luther a true prophet or a false one? And two, was the institution he claimed to be reforming really in need of reform? So you could defend the institutional Roman Catholic Church by appealing to the idea that Luther simply made some false claims and that the church was indeed unimpeachable in that case. But I think it would contradict one of the central themes of the New Testament to say that the church cannot get it wrong. Because, of course, that's what the chief priests and elders among the Pharisees said and taught of their church, so to speak. But God sent Jesus anyway, as if to overthrow their own over-attachment to their precious institution. Now, try to calm down, okay? Relax. I'm not actually making any judgment right now about Martin Luther or the Catholic Church, or Judaism, actually. I'm only using that scenario as an example. But the point that I really want to make here is that if you believe that law and institutions are final, are carved in stone, so to speak, and beyond challenge, then you have to consider the possibility that John the Baptist and Jesus were just out of line, and that they were basically liberals subverting, challenging, deconstructing a based trad legal regime, and they had no right to challenge it. Now, of course, if you're a Christian, or if you call yourself a Christian, you'll want to wiggle out of this jam, and you'll want to say, well, hold on. No. That was, the thing with John and Jesus was a one-time exception to this problem. It's sort of an anomaly, The one time that God really did overthrow his institution. But now, you'll want to say, all the challengers to the papacy or, whatever, the church, are implicitly wrong because the papacy or whatever is implicitly right and can't be wrong. But again, consider John 10:34, where Jesus does not defend his claim to being the Son of God status on a particular or an exceptional basis, but rather he appeals to Psalm 82:6 and offers a universal defense that would work for anyone, or at least any Jew at the time, who claimed to be a son of God. It's a strange defense. It's one you really need to think about. So, okay, I hope you've carefully considered this next phase of the argument. Moving on. The way to really test yourself in all this is to think about, right now, 2021, a rumor going around telling of a shirtless, bug-eating man hollering out somewhere in the woods or in a desert about the end of the world right now. And ask yourself whether you would really be inclined to go listen to him preach, and even let him baptize you. Would your existing institutional church approve of that, approve of his authority? The point is, Jesus went to hear John in that situation, and to be baptized by him. This was extra-institutional religion. And this is truly one of the central themes of our religious text. No doubt about it, okay? But again, relax. I'm not necessarily challenging any particular institution right now. What I'm trying to do is to ask how institutions acquire and enforce their own authority, and by what right people sometimes challenge them. I mean, look, Thomas More was challenging authority, right? Again, by what right did he do that? And Anne Hutchinson challenged authority when she was asked by John Winthrop, what gave her the right to teach? Well, listen, by the way, to what she said. Actually, it was Mr. Noel of the colony who asked her directly while Winthrop listened. Quote, Noel says, "How do you know that that was the Spirit you heard talking to you?" And Mrs. Hutchinson says, again, interesting that she answers with a question, just like Jesus. How did Abraham know that it was God that bid him offer his son, being a breach of the sixth commandment? How did Abraham know? Well, guess what happened, by the way, in that case, in Hutchinson's case? The institution, the Puritan Church of Massachusetts, banished her, right? And look, maybe that's okay. Maybe that was just, you guys. I get it. Some of you want to say that. The law is force, and it forced a conniving, subversive woman out. Okay, like maybe you want to say that. But again, the Jews who demanded Jesus' death might have made a very similar claim to that one. Okay? Now soon, as I said, for my 100th video, I'm going to do an episode about how the Apostle Paul tears the law to shreds in his letter to the Galatians. And I might quote from Romans some too. And when you watch that video, I want you to remember this. If you believe that moral problems can be resolved by institutions, and that institutions, once established, ought never to be challenged, then you very well might disagree with Paul and, be Jewish. But the very stunning intervention that the New Testament makes in history, the shift to, the new covenant, this new deal, alludes to an idea that there is actually something more authoritative than the law. Remember, Derrida said at the outset, a law that not only exceeds or contradicts law, droit, but also, perhaps, has no relation to law, or maintains such strange relation to it, that it may just as well command the droit that excludes it. And what is this law that excludes or that contradicts law? Well, it's the Holy Spirit, of course. I mean, and think of Abraham, right? Abraham knew very well that he was not supposed to kill his son. Everyone knows not to murder their son. Even before the law of Moses, it's clear you're not supposed to do that. And yet, when the Holy Spirit came to him and said, do it, he was ready to do it, right? And that is why he was credited as being righteous. That is an extra-legal form of morality, where the pro-moral thing to do is to not follow the law, okay? Now, admittedly, the Holy Spirit living that way poses its own set of social, political problems. You will want to ask right away, I know you will, many of you, well, what if someone claims that the Holy Spirit wants them to be free to do sodomy or whatever, something like that? And this is an indeed difficult problem. I mean, okay, I'm admitting that. Watch how I handle this. Yes, this is a quandary. This is a difficulty. I do not have a perfect solution to this problem. Okay? But hopefully you can start to see here, let me start that over again. What you can start to see here is that when there is a problem of moral licentiousness and depravity, and what we in our circle have tended to call degeneracy, there is one faction among us who believe that by swinging the pendulum in exactly the opposite direction, they can fix things. And this tends to sound like utopian thinking to me, because they don't say things like, yes, this is a difficult problem, we don't have a perfect solution, but maybe some gestures in the direction of legalism would help a little bit. No, they say, we need to install a strongman fascist and he'll make the sluts stop wearing yoga pants. You know what I mean? They say it as if it's a solution. What I'm arguing here is that these two testaments or covenants, considered philosophically more than theologically, politically philosophically more than theologically, are both trying to navigate this difficult problem of authority and the law. The Old Testament errs on the side of legalism, And this is why Jesus laments in Matthew 23, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you," etc., right? But perhaps you might want to argue that the New Testament errs by going too far in the opposite direction, forgiving sin without sacrifices and dropping the requirements of the law, and even including Gentiles and so on, basically leaving people without direction. But if we're to distinguish between Judaic legal thought and Christian legal thought, as articulated by Paul, we would certainly say that the Jews were people of the law, or who erred on the side of the law, and the Christians are people on the side of Spirit, who allow for the Spirit, who claim that it was wrong to crucify Jesus, even though he contradicted the established authority, the ruling elders, right, the chief elders and priests and so on. And yet, I look around me and lo, I see a lot of Christians calling for Judaic kinds of solutions. And I think they're misguided. Listen to Paul. He says, quote, "If a law had been given that could impart life, then righteousness would certainly have come by the law. But Scripture has locked up everything under the control of sin, so that what was promised, being given through faith in Jesus Christ, might be given to those who believe." Not who follow the law, you see. Okay, look, why am I doing this? What is this episode about? Am I just trying to subvert the based right-wing legalist movement? No, I'm not. I actually think it's not based. I think they're wrong, and I want to try to teach them to be based, okay? Okay, look, let me name a few institutions for your consideration so that we can now think clearly together. The American Medical Association, the CDC, the Department of Education, universities, the New York Times, the United Methodist Church, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Science, Hollywood, basically, right? The World Bank, the UN, YouTube, with an assist from the ADL, and yes, the papacy, the Vatican, right? And of course, the American government. Now, looking at this list, I want you to consider whether the solution we need now is A, Judaic, which is to say law enforcing, or B, Christian, which is to say law undermining, law subverting. Consider who runs these institutions now. What sort of Pharisees sit in the seats of power now? Is the law bringing life to anyone now? And I guess if we're not using Judaic and Christian as indicators of, if we are using Judaic and Christian as indicators of a philosophical premise, what if it's not entirely about one covenant or the other, not superseding one or the other, not choosing one or the other? What if these are sort of like the Scylla and Charybdis of real life in society? Can we maybe admit that the law itself on one side is insufficient, and also admit that life totally without law would also be very difficult or bad or insufficient? In certain conversations with Christians, I have heard people admit that in its sort of, deducible or imaginable late first century form, in its pre-Constantine form, Christianity did not provide a sufficient framework for law. And this is certainly what I find in the New Testament. It is a deconstruction of the old law primarily, and it does not offer a totalizing replacement so far as legal theory or practice is concerned. Let me just state my unruly, daring, radical, and provocative conclusion here, and then you can deal with me in the comments as you like. Christianity was an undoing. It was a liberation from the slavery that was the law. It was unmistakably more liberal than its predecessors in both Jerusalem and Athens, in terms of legal theory. It is encapsulated by that very famous scene at the beginning of John 8, where Jesus prevented the Pharisees from stoning to death an adulteress. I mean, oh, she's still a sinner, he'll say, but who has the nerve to carry out justice, the punishment, right? Now, if I read you right, my viewers, almost all of you believe I'm kind of wrong about this. You all believe, either with Nietzsche, who thinks that like Christianity was a weakening thing, or with the based Catholics who think that like I've gone too far in a Protestant direction, but you all believe that law makes men just, and that we simply cannot live without the law. But just as Paul did, I want to point to you again to Abraham, who lived 430 years before the law was given, Paul points out in Galatians 3. How did he live? How did Abraham live? He listened to God. Why was he not destroyed? Why did he not spiral out into moral degeneracy? Because he believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now, this essay by Derrida was delivered in English, in the language of English, for a conference called Deconstruction and the Possibility of Justice. And I think it's for that reason, the Englishness of it, I think, that it's among his most readable essays, at least for us English speakers. So read along again so that you can understand one more little section. He says in one point in the essay, quote, "Law, droit, is not justice. Law is the element of calculation, and it is just that there be law. But justice is incalculable and aporetic." That is, aporia-inducing. Okay? Aporetic experiences are the experiences as improbable as they are necessary of justice. That is to say, of moments in which the decision between just and unjust is never ensured by a rule. End quote. This is a description of what he called for at the beginning of the episode I'm doing. That is, a law that has nothing to do with law. Okay, what can this mean? Derrida goes on to speak of, quote, some aporias. And to give some examples, his first one is the one that I always consider first when I'm swimming in these waters. Again, I've been thinking about this for 20 years. The way he puts it, quote, "Our common axiom is that to be just or unjust, and to exercise justice, or I would say morality, I must be free and responsible for my actions, behavior, thought, decisions." And already you should intuit the problem here. The law announces "thou shalt" and "thou shalt not." But it also puts a gun to your head, right? That's what makes it the law. That's what gives it authority. And so the result is that you must be a free agent in order to be engaged in moral acts, acting without compulsion. But then you also, paradoxically, must act in accordance with a law or a rule. And if you don't, the gun. So how does that work, right? You all speak of and lament degeneracy and the decline that you perceive in moral values. By the way, that's one of the themes that you'll find in the literature of all ages. I want to note that everyone is always talking about how kids these days are depraved, right? So be a little suspicious about that. But you seek to remedy the problem by application of the law, which is to say by force of law. When you force a man or a woman wearing yoga pants, you change the nature of their action from moral to mechanical. The best example of this I can recall is if you remember this scene from the harrowing movie Seven. Check it out quick.
Get this thing off of me! Get this thing off of me! Get this thing off!
And I almost hope you don't remember that scene. That's the terrible scene where the guy was forced at the point of a gun to do truly terrible things to someone else. Do we hold him accountable morally? Nah. Indeed, we sort of cringe for him. It's a terrible thing that happened to him. But it works the other way also, right? Though far more subtly. When the law, which is to say the gun, is pointed at your head, and it says, don't do that, and you don't do that, you're not in a state of grace. You are not a profoundly moral person. You're in a state of slavery. Watch again the Dale Martin clip.
He's saying more and more negative things about the Jewish law. 323, before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith would be revealed. Now the law becomes a prison guard that keeps humanity, and he seems to be talking about all of humanity, not just Jews. Somehow the law, the Jewish law, put all of humanity in prison and kept it there all those years. Look what
And now listen to Johnny Cash read Galatians 5:1. And thanks for listening. See you next time on The Godward Show.
Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with a yoke of bondage. Indeed, I, Paul, say to you that if you become circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing. And I testify again to every man who becomes circumcised that he is a debtor to keep the whole law. You have become estranged from Christ, you who attempt to be justified by law. You have fallen from grace. For we, through the Spirit, eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness by faith.
Oh, bye-bye. The secret stream tonight, I think, Friday night, going to be great. We might have Geo on. I don't know. Things are getting hot around here. And then we're going to do it again every 2 weeks. So if you like this show and you want to think with me more, the link to the Patreon is in the description. You can get into the secret streams and enter. We'll teach you the secret handshake that we do in the Illuminati thing. All right, bye, you guys. Thanks for listening.